Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of the podcast about enzymes and molecules. I am Roberta Foresti, professor of biochemistry at the University of Paris-Créteil and researcher at the Mondor Institute of Biomedical Research in France. The topic of our discussion today is environmental stress and how it affects our susceptibility to develop diseases. But although we are more and more familiar with the danger of air pollution, which increases lung disease and is being implicated in neurodegeneration or cardiovascular disorders, we often do not consider noise, which is a very important external stressor. We are surrounded by noise, especially in the urban space, cars, public transport, construction works, etc., are all a continuous source of noise. Therefore, a major question for today will be, how is noise impacting our health? For this episode, we have the very good fortune to host Dr. Andreas Daiber, full professor in molecular cardiology at the University Medical Center Mainz in Germany, who has specialized in the study of noise and its consequences on cardiovascular health. Andreas Daiber is a trained biochemist, obtaining a PhD from the University of Constance and continuing in Germany for his postdoctoral studies at the University of Constance, the Eppendorf University Hospital in Hamburg, and then at the University Medical Center in Mainz. Progressing from this position at this same university, he was first head of molecular cardiology prior to becoming temporary professor in 2008. Dr. Daiber was also a guest professor in Grenoble, France, in 2011 before obtaining his tenure position in Mainz. Professor Daiber's laboratory is investigating how the physical environment that includes noise and air pollution is implicated in the development of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. In particular, Dr. Daiber is focused on the molecular players that respond to these external stressors and participate in mediating or protecting against vascular dysfunction, performing research in patients and in animal models. Dr. Daiber is a prolific author and an editor of many renowned journals in the field of redox biology. Good afternoon, Andreas. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It is great to have you with us for this episode.
Thank you so much, Roberta, for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite research topics, traffic noise and stress reactions.
Great. We have a lot of interesting aspects to cover with you today, as researching through this subject really stimulated so many questions for you. What is noise? How it impacts our health? When are we more vulnerable to the effects of noise? And very importantly, what can we do to counteract noise to safeguard our health? So we hope our listeners will enjoy this conversation with Dr. Daiber. Andreas, we kick off with the first question. Could you start by telling us what are the criteria used to define noise and how can we differentiate it from a normal sound?
So when we talk about noise, then it's rather the unwanted exposure to sound, let's say. Usually even it's mostly anthropogenic sound. Yeah. So it's rather unusual that you get highly annoyed, let's say, and also face some health impact by natural sound. This is unusual. So therefore, usually it's really the anthropogenic, the human-made sound that is called noise, which is a rather disturbing, unwanted exposure to sound.
I assume there are maybe some thresholds that we can consider in order to distinguish between what is really this anthropogenic and deleterious noise that we hear versus what you are saying maybe is the natural sounds that are not really affecting us in the same way?
Yeah. So, but basically, just to in order to already, let's say, uh, talk about a topic we will probably later talk on more detailed. So there are the two different pathways of noise, the direct and indirect, yeah. And if we consider that, then the direct pathway would be damage of the inner ear. And for this, you need really, let's say, noise with a quite high sound pressure level. And usually it's thought that chronic exposure to noise above 90 decibel clearly induces hearing loss and causes inner ear damage, whereas the recommendation by the World Health Organization for the daily noise exposure is 55 decibel. And it's said that, yeah, usually if you stay below this threshold, then you will not have a quite high risk from noise. Yeah, despite meanwhile we know there is, let's say, no lower threshold in that. So therefore, you also face health effects if you are exposed to 45 decibel during the day. But usually we cannot measure it because the risk increase is so small that we cannot really statistically get it. Yeah. And for noise exposure during the night, the World Health Organization says it should be not more than 45 decibel on the average. Yeah. So therefore, already by seeing that you have a lower threshold at night, probably tells us night exposure is somewhat more detrimental.
Yes, we are coming back to that. We have a question,
Mhm.
which is, one of the things that was really interesting for me. Obtaining your full professorship in Mainz stimulated your research in noise, stimulated your interest in noise research, and your work clearly demonstrated how noise negatively impacts cardiovascular health. Can you elaborate on how this happens from a mechanistic point of view? I'm thinking noise out there, and all of a sudden I start to develop cardiovascular disease, vascular dysfunction.
Yeah, this only works if we also look at the brain. So therefore, even let's say for a cardiologist or cardiovascular researcher, you cannot explain noise effects without also looking at the brain effect that noise has. And at the brain level, it's, let's say, very easy, like any kind of stressor. So noise will cause arousal in some brain regions. Usually it's thought meanwhile that it's the amygdala, for example, which is the brain's central region that defines the fight or flight reflex. Yeah. Then we have two quite specific pathways how the signal is mediated further and progresses. And one of them is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, so the HPA axis, that finally leads to the output of cortisol, or in rodents, it's corticosterone. And on the other hand, we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is easily activated by all kind of stressors and will cause the release of catecholamines such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And cortisol and catecholamines, they are quite strong triggers of, let's say, in the long run, of immune cell activation. So whereas cortisol in the acute setting will rather suppress immune cell reactivity, it will cause in the long run, after chronic exposure, cortisol resistance and then an overshooting activation of the immune system. So therefore, both of these pathways will lead to inflammation reactions, which will then be followed by enhanced oxidative stress. So therefore, it's the quite classical, let's say, damage mechanism that we also know from some traditional chronic disease like hypertension or ischemic heart disease. Also there, inflammation and oxidative stress play a major role.
Very interesting. Before we continue with the mechanisms, why do you think noise was kind of neglected as environmental stressors until recently?
So mostly this is due, as you said in your intro, air pollution is a quite dominating environmental risk factor. Yeah, it's really well studied over the years. We know it roughly kills 8 million people per year at a global level. So therefore, it's just at the same level as a risk factor as tobacco smoking. So therefore, it's incredible. Yeah. And of course, because of this dominating role of air pollution, let's say it's not so easy for other environmental risk factors to really get recognition. Yeah. And the major problem for noise research is that so far we don't have really high resolution global noise exposure maps. And without a clear exposure, let's say, exposure measurement system, so where you at least can, at the address level of participants of studies, clearly say what the exposure is exactly. Without that, let's say, global research is impossible. And therefore, at the moment, we have really a scattered situation where we have quite good exposure maps at the national level in some countries, but in between there are really wide gaps on the global map.
I see.
Mm.
Yes, so coming back to the molecular players that mediate the effects of noise, you studied NRF2, of course, you were mentioning oxidative stress, which responds to a variety of stresses and is a key transcription factor that we have already extensively discussed with Albina Dinkova-Kostova. What is the role of NRF2 in this noise stress response?
Mm. As you said, NRF2 is really a quite broad response mechanism, how the cell or the organism tries to compensate for some external stressors. These could be multiple origin, so heat stress, oxidative stress, and also noise stress, and therefore, for me, for us in Mainz, NRF2 is rather a readout and a response mechanism, how the cell and the organism react after noise exposure. And of course, it's highly protective. This we have shown by either administrating some drugs that increase NRF2 activation, or also the downstream principle hemoxygenase 1. And if you do that, then you can prevent a large part of the noise detrimental effects. On the other hand, if you block, for example, the hemoxygenase 1 pathway, then you get overshooting exacerbation of damage. Yeah. So therefore, for me, it's clearly protective NRF2, and it's a unspecific reaction of the cell of the organism after this stressor.
Yes.
Mhm.
So if you find that NRF2 is activated during your experiments with using noise stress, you know that you are using the right stimuli and you know that you are having the response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a positive readout that exposure worked.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose this is also true in humans, or you think the data are very strong in animals, but in humans, we are not really at that level yet of knowledge.
So we did not look for, because in human studies so far we were restricted to these O-link panels, which is, let's say, quite specific panels of plasma proteins can be measured there in a high throughput manner. But you don't have a full flexibility to at which targets you want to look.
Yeah.
And therefore, so far, the panels we used, there was no readout, a direct readout for NRF2 included. I think for NRF2 itself, also plasma levels are not so easy because
Yes.
it's a rather cytosolic nuclear protein. So we thought of, because we have a nice HPLC assay to look for bilirubin and biliverdin levels, to use this as a readout. Also, we had a try, and you have to see that the variability in humans is, of course, so huge, also depending on what they have had for a meal, or whether they are in a stress situation or whatever, genetic predisposition. So therefore, it's not so easy to use such parameter for a clear readout of NRF2 activation.
Yeah, so it's more difficult. You don't still have the
Yes.
specific marker to say that NRF2, we assume that it's functioning in the same way because we know that NRF2 is present in humans for sure. And we assume that probably the response and the adaptation to this noise stress is similar. Are there other molecular players that you discovered in your research as crucial for this adaptation to noise stress?
Yeah, a really central player is the phagocytic NADPH oxidase, so the NOX2, or previously termed GB91-FOX. We knocked it out in mice, and then they were completely protected from noise effects. And vice versa. We also know that phagocytic immune cells play a central role, probably due to the presence of the NOX2 there, because we used a genetic model for ablation of myelomonocytic cells, which is done here in Mainz by using a model of colleagues from immunology department, by using this lyse-M3 IDTR mice. These are mice that overexpress inducible diphtheria toxin receptor on the lyse-M positive cells, and the lyse-M positive cells are usually the myelomonocytic cells like monocytes, macrophages, granulocytes. And by then therapy or treatment with low-dose diphtheria toxin, you can specifically kill those cells overexpressing the receptor for it. Yeah. So therefore, it's a really elegant model that we just adapted from the colleagues, and it works perfectly. Yeah. And with this, we could show if you ablate the lyse-M positive myelomonocytic cells, then also you get rid of, let's say, almost all of the detrimental noise effects, but only in the circulation, not in the brain. Yeah. And this is very interesting because we thought you could also, let's say, improve the cerebral damage and phenotype that you clearly have after noise. You have neuroinflammation, you have oxidative damage in the brain. You get per se activation, so therefore you get migration of astrocytes to some brain regions where you usually should not have them. So therefore many things go on there. And interestingly, we thought you would also apply it, for example, the microglia by this diphtheria toxin protocol, but they were not ablated because they are lyse-M low expressors. And therefore, the brain phenotype persisted in the noise-exposed mice, but there was a clear cut in all of the, let's say, peripheral vessels, for example. The effect was gone. And this clearly shows how you can separate between brain and heart and cardiovascular signaling by ablating the cells either only in the periphery and the remote organs or directly in the brain, which was not the case.
Very interesting.
Mhm.
So probably oxidative stress is very important also in the brain, but there could be interventions that help you to target more the periphery rather than the brain. And you can really separate the effect of NOx in the periphery versus what happens into the brain. Very interesting model. Yes, very clean in a way. Yes. So NADPH oxidase, certainly superoxide, which again is maybe coming from also activation by other kind of stresses. And I'm thinking about, we already talked about air pollution. Is there an additive, synergistic effect of noise with other environmental stressors? We combine air pollution, chemicals, exposure in water, noise. What are the consequences of these multi-exposures?
Mhm. So here I would really, like to say, usually our body is well prepared to defend against some stressors or also, let's say, unhealthy conditions. Yeah. Some people smoke the whole life and they will not die. They just survive and get 80 years old or 90 years old. So therefore, obviously, our body is well trained to cope with some stressors. But if we have many stressors, then at a certain point, a threshold is reached where the body cannot defend anymore or the organism cannot defend anymore. And then this is this kind of point of no return, yeah, when the entire system, let's say, escalates and then we get a lot of accumulation of oxidative damage, we get immune cell infiltration, and this is the situation then when really, let's say everything is on the edge, either we remove some of the stressors, then it goes back to normal, or the stressors proceed, and then I would suggest or think the entire organism, the individual will die. Yeah. And the same we have with environmental exposures. So there are only few rare studies where this was really investigated, but we had one of them in the lab. I still think it's a unique study that we conducted there because we exposed mice simultaneously to air pollutant particulate matter and aircraft noise. And what we realized, this was clearly expected, the primary target organ for air pollution was the lung. So therefore, we observed a lot of, let's say, lung inflammation and oxidative stress reactions going on there. Whereas the noise, the primary target organ was the brain. There we observed neuroinflammation, also release of stress hormones. But then you can imagine that upon prolonged exposure to both of these stressors, the lung inflammation and oxidative damage will at a certain point spread over to the entire circulation. So therefore, there will be release also of danger-associated patterns that will activate in other immune cells in the circulation. Also, local inflammation in the lung will spread over to the circulation by release of cytokines, very easy mechanism. So therefore, via the lung inflammation and oxidative damage, the entire organism will be affected. And noise will do that via the brain. So first there is damage in the brain and neuronal activation, release of stress hormones, which then affects at a certain time point the entire organism by really causing systemic inflammation and oxidative stress reactions via the catecholamine and cortisol signaling. So, and then of course you can expect that if you have the lung and the brain pathway acting in concert, that you will have additive damage at a certain level. Yeah, because it comes from different sides, the stressor and the problems, and therefore you may expect or should expect that you have additive damage in some other remote organs, and this is exactly what we observed with this study. In the aorta, for example, or in the heart, we observed additive damage when you had a co-exposure. And we are very lucky. This was also confirmed now by colleagues in Denmark, because they have excellent exposure maps for Denmark, and they have a very strong national health registry where they can then assign at the address level what exposure is for this individual, and then look at the health history. And therefore, they can conduct really high quality exposure studies. And what they found is they looked at co-exposures of fine particulate matter, ultra-fine particle exposure, lack of green space, which is also a very new and very strong environmental stressor if you don't have green space available around you, and finally traffic noise. And then they have shown in the study that you have a cumulative risk score for each exposure that comes on top. And this they did for diabetes risk, for myocardial infarction risk, and stroke risk. And for all of these three major diseases, they could show that additive exposure or co-exposure causes cumulative risk increase.
This is quite scary what you are saying, because
Yes.
the environment you are describing to me that is causing these, detrimental effects on our health is basically the urban environment where I live, where maybe you live, very little green, lots of noise all the time, and of course, air pollution, different particles, different particle sizes that we are discovering are affecting our health. So it's really a all or nothing. If we go to the countryside, we are then in an environment where there is very little noise, hopefully, clean air, better for sure than what we have in the city, and we have the green space that you are talking about. So lots of thoughts, in this respect for us.
So it's
Maybe
very complex.
very complex.
Sure. At the first view, you would say living at a rural site is much more healthy than living in an urban site. Yeah. But if you look in more detail, then it might be there is not so good medical treatment or surgery at a rural site, which already brings you some disadvantages. Yeah.
Yes.
Then it could be that the farmer next to you throws some pesticides on the field. Yeah. And then you will be exposed to pesticides. So therefore, you never know what happens, and in the end, I would say only the large epidemiological studies will really help to answer these questions, whether in the end it's better to live at a rural site or in a large city. Yeah.
Yes. Well, from what you're saying, and we will discuss a little bit later about this, we can certainly do a lot to make our cities healthier for us, but we will come back to that. We already started to mention about the brain, which obviously we understood is very important for this response to noise stress. And I'm thinking about the fact that we have a circadian rhythm where we are awake during the day and alert, and we need to sleep during the night. And during the night, obviously, we necessitate this calm and peaceful environment, which again may be difficult to achieve if we are living in the city. Do we know if noise has a bigger impact when we are exposed to it during the day or during the night?
This is a very important point. I have already mentioned the threshold from the World Health Organization guidelines. And since the night threshold is lower, we can already, let's say, imagine that probably the nighttime exposure is more detrimental, and this is exactly the case. This is true for humans. There are excellent studies, especially the airport studies, the big ones, where at multiple European airports, the studies looked at the population living there and compared with other population living far from airport. And then clearly it came out that especially during the nighttime, there was a clear increase in hypertension risk, for example, that of course also translated to premature deaths or severe cardiovascular events. We did it also in the mice, yeah. So therefore, of course, in rodents, the sleep wake cycle is just reverse. So therefore, when I talk about it, then usually I say when mice were exposed during the sleeping time, I do not talk about night and day or the awake phase. We realized that when they were exposed during the sleeping time, all the effects were almost as strong as the around-the-clock noise exposure. But when they were exposed during the awake time, then most of the detrimental effects were not significant anymore. Clearly indicating that mice obviously can cope quite well with exposure when they are awake. And they have a problem with their sleep, which is fragmented and impaired by sleep time noise exposure. In humans, yes, also the nighttime noise exposure is more detrimental because, as you said, we need a healthy sleep because this regulates a lot of basic biological functions. And if we disturb this circadian rhythm, then we get shift in a lot of gene and protein expression patterns, which will completely dysregulate our intrinsic biological biochemical system. But humans are also special because if they are exposed during the day, they can develop annoyance reactions, yeah, which is obviously not so much the case in mice. So therefore, their mouse models are probably not optimal. But humans, so you can imagine if you talk to another person and then a loud car passes by and you cannot hear what the other person tells you, then you get annoyed. Yeah, that's a clear direct reaction that we have if our, let's say, normal activities are disturbed by noise, then we develop an annoyance reaction. And annoyance will create stress, yeah, especially if you are, let's say, the type for that really can go into this annoyance and, oh, now this is awful and what should I do? then the stress reaction will become even more pronounced. And that's why we also meanwhile talk a lot about resilience against stress. Yeah. There are people, they
Resilience.
are resilient against noise, so they don't care for that. And other persons are not, they get highly annoyed, develop a lot of stress, and therefore probably live much unhealthier than a person that has a high resilience against that.
This is really fascinating.
Hmm.
What distinguishes a person that is resilient to noise stress, for example, to, from another person? What kind of, is it known what kind of features, personalities, biochemistry there is behind this resilience or non-resilience?
So resilient persons definitely have lower stress hormone levels
Mm-hmm.
after exposure to higher noise levels. And in the end, of course, there are also studies that they have a better prognosis in the long run. Yeah.
For sure.
And we can help this resilience by, let's say, doing some yoga or yeah, just also take some relax phases, yeah, where you just come down a bit. Um, Maybe also even drink a tea, take the time for it. So I think all of that helps to become a resilient person. Yeah.
But some people maybe are just lucky by birth and they are more
Yes.
resilient than
Yeah.
others.
Yeah. There we need a lot of research because really not much so far is known about these biochemical resilience mechanisms. So therefore, as soon as there are some targets identified, I'm sure you will find it also in some genetic patterns of persons that are, yeah, really resilient. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I have another question. Has anybody done any study on deaf people and see whether the noise is affecting some of their, because I know they can perceive vibrations
Mhm.
and this, which is associated to noise, for example. Maybe there is a response also to that. Maybe this is a very difficult question and nobody has really done anything on this. But maybe it could be an interesting model to compare to normal people, even in mice.
Definitely, yes. Also, maybe again, you have to realize that deaf people have a lot of also disadvantages in daily life. So
Of course.
therefore, they might have stress conditions where
Yes.
others can cope very easily with situations. So therefore, I'm not sure whether you can really have it in the general population by just picking out some
Yeah.
deaf people, whether you will find differences there. But I'm quite sure that you will have differences if you do controlled exposure studies, as we did in Mainz. Yeah. So
What
therefore,
does it mean, control exposure studies?
so we exposed in some studies healthy volunteers for one night with aircraft and railway noise pattern, and then looked the day before and the day after in the morning for some effects, and especially endothelial function, which can be measured by this flow-mediated dilation is very sensitive to all kind of stress reactions and especially also onset of oxidative stress. So therefore, we have seen clear effects after one night of aircraft noise exposure in these controlled exposure studies.
I
And what
see.
we also have seen is if you expose coronary artery disease patients for one night, which was also done by the colleagues in cardiology here, then they have an even higher damage that they experience from the noise exposure. as compared to the healthy volunteers.
I see. Very interesting. Lots of things to learn. Does it make a difference for our disease risk if we are conscious or not about the noise that is surrounding us? Let me give you an example of what I mean. I come to work, I'm on the metro, and I am completely aware of the noise around me. The train is making a noise. I have my fellow passenger talking on the phone, annoying me, like you were saying. Or I could be sitting on the metro, reading my book, fully focused on what I'm reading. The noise is still there, but I'm not tuned on the noise. Does it make a difference on the way my body will be reacting, whether it's consciously or unconsciously heard the noise?
So during the day, I again would say it depends then on, yeah, what kind of annoyance reactions it creates. And if you say you read a book and you don't care for the other noise around you, then I would expect you are not annoyed and you will not have stress. Yeah. But if you hear your neighbor talking on the phone very loud, yeah, then also I'm a person that really can get highly annoyed, and I then sometimes can even feel how so it gets warm in my head, and I have the feeling, oh, now my blood pressure increases.
Yes.
Yeah, so therefore, I think during the day, it really depends on how, yeah, you deal with the surrounding noise. In contrast, there are studies during the nighttime exposure um, where it has been shown. So you can ask by questionnaire, did you wake up by the noise exposure during the night? Yeah, and then you have a clear readout. If people say, yes, I woke up 3 times, then you can expect the sleep quality was not very good. Yeah, and then you would probably assume that there are some detrimental health effects associated. But even if people did not answer with I woke up 3 times, but with the camera you could see that, yeah, they moved a bit more during sleep. So therefore, unconsciously, they obviously, yeah, realized the noise that they were exposed to. So therefore, even this had a clear health effect. Yeah. So therefore, you don't need really the active realization of the noise around you, but it can be also unconsciously.
So this conversation with you made me realize, something that I really didn't think about. The fact that noise will affect our brain, our cardiovascular system because of because of an intrinsic response of our organism to this stress. But at the same time, our response to this annoyance response will contribute to the detrimental effect of this stress. It will exacerbate and maybe, make this stress even more dangerous for us, simply because our response to it causes another series of another cascade of biochemical responses that exacerbates the damage that is already initiated by the noise,
Yeah.
but can be exacerbated by our reaction, which maybe is not the same for air pollution. What do you think?
No. So I think air pollution is somewhat different there. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe noise is a particular stress that differentiates, even though there may be some common mechanisms with air pollution in terms of activation of similar stress response, NRF2 or whatever, NADPH oxidase, whatever it could be. But in terms of noise stress, we have some other mechanisms that can contribute to the damage.
Definitely.
Very interesting. So, going towards the end of our conversation, I'm sure in your studies you also thought not only about what kind of mediators cause the stress, what kind of damage is caused by noise stress, but also how can we counteract, we as individuals, how can we counteract the negative effects of noise for our own health?
Yeah. So definitely we at the individual level we can do some preventive actions by lifestyle changes. So it's clear healthy diet will help. Probably there are no studies in humans so far, but we did it with the mice. If you make them exercise, then they cope very well with the noise effects. They are almost gone then, yeah, which is highly related to activation of AMPK, of AMP activated protein kinase. Also NRF2 activation by some drugs or healthy diet again will help there. Unfortunately, there are no studies so far on physical exercise against noise stress and noise-mediated health effects, whereas a lot of these studies are available for air pollution. Yeah. And for air pollution, physical exercise or outdoor physical activity is highly protective until a certain level of air pollution. And if you go above that level in highly polluted cities, then physical exercise outdoor becomes highly detrimental. Yeah. I think for noise, usually I would say, yeah, it should be protective. Yeah. So therefore, I would love to see some human studies where people look for the beneficial effects of physical exercise in highly noise exposed people.
So you're saying that probably if we increase our stress response
Mhm.
by other means, we then become more tolerant to what
Yes.
is the response, the adaptation that we
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
for noise.
But in
Yes,
the end, of course, yeah, let's say this cannot be the final
solution.
solution for the entire problem. Yeah, because there, of course, we need policymakers that they really enforce strict noise exposure thresholds or limits. Because besides the fact that we don't have the high resolution noise exposure maps at a global level, which really prevents, yeah, let's say, joint effort and research in this direction, the other major problem is, whereas we have clear legal limits for air pollution, yeah, so therefore for
Yes.
different particulate matter categories or nitrogen dioxide levels, you have strict legal limits, but for noise, you only have recommendations.
Mm.
You have no legal limit, yeah, that if a city would exceed it, that the population in the city could go to court and could yeah, just send the lawyers and say this we don't want to have. You don't have this possibility at the moment. And therefore, what we need are really legally binding limits for noise exposure, which is also a kind of ridiculous because for, let's say, almost any machine, you have legal limits for how loud the machine can be. Yeah, you have it for cars, you have it for motor bicycles. So there are clear legal limits. So it can be 70 decibel when it runs on the street. but you don't have a legal limit for the combined exposure by all your surrounding noise sources. And that's somehow a big shortcoming.
Yes, so we are recognizing for certain things that noise is not good,
Yeah,
but at the same time, we are not considering it as one of these important stressors, environmental stressors
no,
that we are exposed to. Maybe this is due to the fact that the research on noise became, developed later compared to air pollution. Maybe it's because, governments are not particularly attentive to this subject.
I think there a big problem. So the noise research started also very early. So already, let's say in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of noise research, but a lot of that is dedicated to occupational noise exposure, and they're mostly dedicated to hearing loss. Yeah. So therefore, so the research on the indirect effects of noise, where you really have the lower sound pressure levels that act via the neuronal activation, the arousal, and then stress hormone signaling, this research has been neglected for many, many years.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and it has obviously now we are starting to see the consequences also thanks to, we are starting to understand
Yeah.
also a little bit better the mechanisms also thanks to the studies that you are doing. In relation to this, I would like to finish by asking you if the results that your research has produced, and of course that also of other investigators on this subject, if our political bodies are actually paying attention to these results, to this research, and maybe are thinking or are considering this data, these results to implement strategies to improve, the environment where we live in the cities and so on. Do you know, is in Germany, for example, you're working in Germany, do you know if the political bodies are interested at all, are listening to what you are saying and the results that you are obtaining?
Yes. It starts at the moment. So I think this the entire movement also that the young generation is very much interested, I would say, in planetary health and all kind of these environmental stressors, of course, also belongs to this overarching topic, planetary health. Yeah. And that's why there is a change at the moment also in politics, yeah, that they start also to come to you and ask, could we sit together and talk and maybe find solutions together? This starts now, yeah, and this is very, let's say, yeah, nice, of course, but also,
Encouraging.
yes, very encouraging, but also quite unexpected because we did not know it from the past. Yeah.
That's great. That makes
Mhm.
me feel a little bit better because, I'm thinking again, I'm living in Paris and we have so many cars. And I think that, we should have in Paris electric cars everywhere. We would reduce the pollution dramatically and we would reduce dramatically also the noise. And of course, we cannot expect that everybody in France or wherever, in other countries will have electric cars, but maybe we can already target some critical places like, these big cities, these very crowded
Mm.
cities with ad hoc solutions, ad hoc interventions that you don't really hear about this. And of course, it would be potentially very expensive at the beginning to implement these policies. But I think in the long run, as you were saying, 8 million people dying every year for pollution. And it's not that, they need care. They develop diseases, they need care, and
Exactly.
all of this is costly. Maybe we don't realize, but in the long run, if we remove the cause of this, we will probably be richer. And even though it seems expensive, it's not so expensive at the end of the day.
So the socioeconomic colleagues, researchers, if they start to calculate the money you could save by,
Yes.
for example, phasing out of fossil fuels, it's incredible numbers that they give you. Yeah,
Yes.
just to phase out from all fossil fuels would create hundreds of billions of savings in the healthcare system everywhere. And it's not only that the people become chronically ill and cost money in the healthcare system, it's also the loss of productivity. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what they, for example, in terms of noise and also other, let's say, environmental chemicals that clearly also affect the brain, what they talk about always is the loss of intellectual power, yeah, of children losing the ability to think properly, to have good cognitive function. And this is also the loss for the society that we have to take into account.
Absolutely. Yes, there are so many implications for this. Well, let's hope that among our listeners, we will have some politicians, some important people there that will understand, how crucial is this subject, and that we have the means to intervene and to improve the situation. So I thank you very much, Andreas. I know that now you are not only focusing on noise, but moving also to research on smoking and other components of smoke. And, I'm going to follow your publications, and maybe I will see you again when you have built up, another strong aspect of your research that could be very interesting to discuss during our podcast. So thank you very much for talking to us today. I wish you all the best, and we will be in touch, and we will follow your very, very interesting research.
Thank you so much, Roberta. It was really a pleasure. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
it's a lot of fun.